coordinator of the DBT STAR College Scheme online invited lecture and interactive session today. I welcome to all participants for joining us, and we are going to have a very interesting session by Sir. So to start with the formal inaugural session, I would now like to request our principal, Sir, Dr. Devnath Pali, to please share his welcome note for the session. Sir, please.
Thank you, madam. Thank you, sir. My
Thank
dear,
you. Thank you.
thank you. Yeah, my dear colleagues. So, without wasting any time, because I am myself is eagerly waiting to hear from you, sir. So, my dear colleagues, the research scholar, then students, you are very lucky enough to have such a wonderful person and eminent person, resource person with us. So, sir, one thing as I mentioned in all seminar or invited lecture, as a head of the institute. So please, whenever you come in Calcutta, please visit our college. So you'll be highly benefited. Not only the faculty, but also the scholar and the students will be benefited. And the DBT STAR College Scheme is only meant for the undergraduate students. And students here are very lucky enough. Our coordinator, madam, always try her level best to organize such a seminar with the eminent resource person all over the pan India, I can say.
Correct,
It is.
correct. No, I think I am looking forward to that.
Yes, please come,
Okay.
please come. And I'm very glad one thing by seeing that some of our colleagues like Asuk Babu, then I do not mention the name of all colleagues, they also that means joined in the online platform, and they also eagerly waiting to hear from you. So once again, my sincere gratitude and warm welcome to sir. Over to Nivedita, madam. Please carry on the program. Okay.
Yeah,
Thank you.
thank you, sir.
Thank you very much for this invitation.
Thank you, sir. Thank you.
Yes, so definitely we will like to have you in our college. So, start with the technical session. We have Dr. Dipanjan with us, who is currently affiliated with the School of AI and Data Science at Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Jodhpur. He is leading the Brain Dynamics, Connectivity and Cognition Lab, working on various research aspects related to neuroimaging, multi-scale computational modeling, EEG, and behavior. The specific areas in which the group contributes, computational models and methods pertaining to learning and memory, perception and attention, aging, and multisensory processing. I would now say it is a very pertinent issue in the modern times, and with such an eminent resource person, we are very honored to have you, sir, for our students and faculty members. So I am also eagerly waiting to hear to you, sir. So over to you, sir, for the technical session. Thanks again.
Thank you very much. First of all, again, I'm sorry for the delay that happened. We should have started a little bit earlier. And thanks to all of you from the bottom of my heart that this is a fantastic opportunity for me to also engage with all of you in during this presentation. And I am really thankful to all the organizers who has taken a lot of effort in inviting me over for this presentation. Before I begin, formally, I just wanted to get an understanding, like how much time do I have for this presentation?
Yeah, so actually it depends on you.
Okay,
Yes, sir.
fine.
So because classes are over, so we have free time now.
Okay, all right.
Yes.
Just wanted to ask or get your feedback. Is my slides visible? Everyone
Yes,
can.
sir. Your
Yes,
side.
sir. Yes, sir.
Yes, sir.
And everyone who is in the audience can also hear me, I think, right?
Yes,
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Okay.
faculty.
Yes,
So
yes, sir.
if anybody wants me to switch from English to Bengali, I presume most of the people are speaking Bengali in the audience.
Yes, sir.
Please do let me know. I will try also my best effort to deliver this talk in bilingual format. Okay.
Yes, sir. Yes.
And wherever there are difficult issues, I'll try to discuss with you in your mother tongue. Right? Okay.
Yes, sir. বাংলায় বললে ছেলেমেয়েদের একটু ভালো লাগবে, বুঝতেও পারবে বেশ।
Okay, fine.
Thank you,
Fine.
thank you, sir.
The reason I am continuing with English one could be because there may be some of my lab members who are not necessarily like, learns Bengali or knows Bengali. So maybe, and there may be some audience. So I just thought, I'll take this opportunity to use bilingual format in order to go ahead with it. Okay.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Yes.
So as you have seen in the talk circulation, that I kind of given this title, which also used by some of the news media, where they talked about recent times a lot of uh, you know what you call interest, and particularly in one area, which is to understand intelligence, right? Like artificial intelligence is one of those areas, but human intelligence is actually often been compared with artificial intelligence. And as we know, that brain as an organ has a very like various type of complexity, right? And also possesses different powers and potential of the brain to understand, as a way to understand actually human cognition, which is one of the biggest unsolved question of this century, in my opinion. And it's going to engage all of us in order to understand that to what level we can understand this brain organization, brain structure, and also brain's function to decode the meaning of human cognition. So that's why I kind of kept this title. এবং এই টাইটেলটার বেসিসে আমার মনে হয় যে একটা বড় অংশ যেটাকে আমরা বলি যে হিউম্যান কগনিশন, সেটাকে আমরা অ্যাড্রেস করতে পারি। So currently, already, as was introduced, that cognitive brain dynamics lab I have is operating from two different locations, predominantly from IIT Jodhpur, because that's where I work. I am primarily affiliated to. But there is also some lab members who have worked with me in the past or working till now. They are in the neuroimaging division at National Brain Research Centers. I have been very fortunate to have excellent number of students who graduated actually from my lab or group, and right now holding both faculty position as well as postdoctoral position in different parts of the world. Okay. And it has always been a pleasure to train or mentor students who becomes future scientists and future leaders in their area of research. Now, first question that many of you may have: what kind of tools and techniques we use to study brain, right? Because brain can be studied using molecular techniques, cellular techniques. It can be studied using different kind of microscopic tools. But in our lab, we are doing human brain recordings. So most of the times we are using tools and techniques which are non-invasive. That means which does not harm human in the process of recording their brain or behavioral data. And one technique that we predominantly use in our lab, which is called electroencephalography, which is now almost like 100 years old technique, which was first time measured by Hans Berger in Germany, and where he recorded brain signals, and there was some kind of accidental finding that the brain areas respond with certain kind of responses over time, and they show a significant amount of oscillations which you can record from the brain in eyes closed and eyes open condition. যখন তুমি চোখ বুজে থাকো, you are not essentially doing any task, you are not essentially looking at anything on the computer screen, and even then there is an internal dynamics of the brain. So you can start seeing how neurons, which are basically the computational units of the brain, they start communicating with each other at certain characteristic oscillations. And I will show you some data from my lab and also otherwise, which will make you understand how these two things go together, and how do we actually make sense of these recordings of the data that we are acquiring from the brain signals. There are also nowadays we are trying out different techniques like virtual reality, where you can use a headset which with camera, which kind of allow you to look at some scenes which are actually in the virtual world, because many of us have a footprint that we present or our presence in the virtual world many of the hours of a day. So it is interesting that if you put people in a situation where you want to study emotion, for example, and you give them a real life scenario of emotion processing in virtual reality setup, how specifically people process those kind of situations, those situations which are real life situations or mimicking real life situations. We also do eye tracking. Eye tracking means where your eyes are moving when you change the position, location, or some physical properties of the stimulus, right? Often something which is bright in the room that actually attracts our attention. So we move our eyes in that particular direction, and eye tracking data, which measures gaze position, fixation, all these things can give us a good idea about how our eye processes our environment. Okay. And then we can do some stimulation. Stimulation means uh, that you can apply certain currents, or you can apply certain magnetic field from outside the brain without actually damaging the underlying tissue or the neurons. And with low intensity currents, you can stimulate certain brain areas to see how internal processing and how external perturbation they seems to work together, and whether these kind of stimulation has the capacity to modulate the activity of the neurons. So this is in a sum what we do in our lab day to day basis. এখানে তোমরা একজন পার্টিসিপেন্টকে দেখতে পাচ্ছ, তার মাথাতে একটা ক্যাপ পরানো হয়েছে. দেয়ার ইজ সাম কাইন্ড অফ electrodes or some kind of cathodes or anodes which are placed over the electrodes, and then you have a wire which goes into a like tablet or a display where you can like change the amount of current that you would like to deliver to that particular brain area. And then the person who is sitting over there will feel some sensations, and these sensations will change the internally generated rhythms or oscillations যেগুলো ব্রেনে নিউরনরা যে রিদমে অ্যাকচুয়ালি ফ্লাকচুয়েট করছে, এবং তার বেসিসে আমরা এদের ব্রেন থেকে সিগন্যাল রেকর্ড করতে পারি, দেখতে পারি যে এই সিগন্যালগুলো কিভাবে মডিউলেটেড হচ্ছে বাইরে থেকে যখন কোনো এক্সটার্নাল কারেন্ট অ্যাকচুয়ালি অ্যাপ্লাই করা হচ্ছে সার্টেন ফ্রিকোয়েন্সিসে। এবং ইন্ডিভিজুয়াল সাবজেক্ট, ইন্ডিভিজুয়াল পেশেন্ট, যেহেতু এক একজনের প্রবলেমস এক এক রকম, so therefore there is a possibility to capture what is known as inter-individual variability, which is similar to when you go to a doctor actually give you a different dose of the medicine, because every individual are different, their genetics are different, their brain sizes are different, and the brain anatomy is also very different. So the way one thing works for one person may not work in the same way for the other individual, right? So therefore there is a existing philosophy in neurofeedback and neuroscience in general when you are doing these kind of experiments, that one size don't fit all, right? So you need different kind of stimulation, different kind of strategies in order to see the same type of response from brains of different participants. That's what we try to understand in our lab as well. These are some example data which you can record from different participants. So for example, here there are two participants. They have been asked by the experimenter to do some kind of things on the computer screen, either to move a cursor on the left hand side of the screen or right hand side of the screen. যখন তুমি কার্সারটাকে লেফট বা রাইটে মুভ করো তখন তোমার অ্যাটেনশন মুভ করে লেফট বা রাইটে, এবং সেই সময় কোনো স্পেসিফিক নিউরো সিগনেচার তুমি দেখতে পারো হচ্ছে তাদের ব্রেন অ্যাক্টিভিটিতে, যেটাকে আমরা বলি হচ্ছে চেঞ্জ ইন দ্য মেমব্রেন পোটেনশিয়াল অফ দ্য নিউরনস। মেমব্রেন পোটেনশিয়াল গুলো ফ্লাকচুয়েট করে ইন টাইম অর ওভার টাইম, এবং তুমি দেখতে পারো যে এই মেমব্রেন পোটেনশিয়াল গুলোর যে শেপ রয়েছে বা তাদের যে তোমার অ্যাম্পলিটিউড রয়েছে সেগুলো অ্যাকচুয়ালি টাইমের সাথে কি করে চেঞ্জ হয়, তাদের ফ্রিকোয়েন্সি টাইমের সাথে কি করে চেঞ্জ হয়, এবং সেটাকে আমরা অ্যাকচুয়ালি ইইজি ডেটা থেকে ইন্টারপ্রিট করতে পারি, যার বেসিসে আমরা বলতে পারি যে এই লোকটা বা এই পার্টিসিপেন্টটা এইরকম ধরনের স্ট্র্যাটেজি অ্যাপ্লাই করেছিল যখন সে এই স্টিমুলাসটাকে প্রসেস করছিল। ঠিক আছে, তো নাও we go into this question of what are the key function of the brain, what are we trying to achieve actually in this process. তো তুমি যদি এই প্রশ্নটা নিজেকে জিজ্ঞেস করো, so we know already from philosophy, from neuroscience, from psychology that we have multiple senses. These are the senses through which we understand our environment, we interact with those environment, and we do our daily living, right? Okay, to stay away from heat and not get into a very cold room, okay, or like trying to process where people, there is not too much of crowd, where there is less crowd. How do we drive our car in a crowded street? So all these are part of different functions of the brain, and there are 5 different functions which are part of our 5 senses, যাকে আমরা বলি পঞ্চেন্দ্রিয়, right? So vision, audition, smell, taste and touch. Now if we understand any mechanisms of the brain for each of these processes, then it will actually help us to develop certain intervention, medical intervention strategies when we have a vision loss, or when we have an auditory impairment, or when we have an impairment of taste or touch, right? So our lab actually investigates some of these questions, particularly dealing with vision and attention, vision and memory, as well as, auditory processing and music processing, because some of these are very important for understanding how normal brain functions. And when we get into some kind of abnormalities in the brain because of some neuropsychiatric or neurodegenerative disorders, then what happens to these processings? And obviously we know many of these also from the newspaper articles that many people write about dementia, Alzheimer's disease, all these kind of problems which are related to memory impairment, right? Which are related to some kind of other impairments. And we also know about sensory impairments like auditory impairments. When somebody becomes older, there is a tendency of hearing loss, right? Which leads to some kind of auditory impairment. Kane kom shunte paye loke. Keno eta hoy? Ebong what is the mechanism? That is actually very interesting. Now, if you look at the brain areas which control for these 5 senses or functions, they include motor areas, which you can kind of see on the screen. I'll just put my pointer right over here. এখানে রয়েছে ব্রেনের মাঝখানের part of the cerebral cortex. You have heard about, I think, gray matter volume and white matter. So you have a gray matter volume over here. This part of the gray matter, which is actually consists of motor area, যেটা আমাদের finger movement, হাতের muscle, fingerer muscle, everything it controls related to reaching, grasping, and all those kind of properties. যার বেসিসে আমরা একটা গ্লাস জল ভর্তি হাতে তুলে নিতে পারি এবং আমাদের মুখের কাছে নিয়ে আসতে পারি, right? Okay. Same kind of sensation when combined with another group of neurons which are located in this area of the brain, which is known as actually somatosensory cortex, এবং যে এরিয়াগুলো responsible for touch. So we can say, I am holding a flower, right? Or I am holding a stone, right? So the difference in the texture of the stone or the flower, we can immediately recognize even if when our eyes are closed. Now that actually is a very interesting question, that how do we combine motor and somatosensory processing, or for example motor and visual processing, right? So যখন আমরা বলি যে মাল্টি সেন্সরি প্রসেসিং, যেটা আমার ল্যাবে লোকেরা ইনভেস্টিগেট করে, তখন আমরা বলতে চাইছি যে দুটো সেন্সেস কি করে কম্বাইন করে ইনফরমেশন, and how do they actually process very complex environment or complex stimuli, right? Okay, so similarly you can go into other sensory processing like gustatory processing, যেখানে তুমি খাবারের স্বাদ বা ঘ্রাণ নাও, বা olfactory processing, and similarly you have auditory processing which is localized in this area of the brain যেখানে আমাদের দুটো কান রয়েছে. So from show some experiments that we did with the sound stimuli, মানে শব্দের সাথে, এবং যখন শব্দটাকে দেওয়া হচ্ছে কানের দুদিকে, তখন কি করে ব্রেন সেটাকে প্রসেস করে, এবং এটা নিয়ে আমি তোমাদের আরো ডিটেলে কিছুক্ষণ পরেই বলবো, তো you will probably understand it much better. Now these are not the only things that the brain do, right? Because it's a really sleeping giant, as I said in the title of my talk. It also is very important for very key functions of the brain, which we all of us actually, without which we will be not human, right? For example, emotion like love, anger, hate, fear, gesture, then attention, right? Without attention we will not be able to learn basic mathematics, right? Or we will not learn language processing, will not learn what is speech processing. Okay, so we need to attend to the stimuli that actually give us these abilities or these key functions of the brain, which we call cognition. Okay, because cognition needs a placeholder, right? When we say cognition, it suddenly starts sounding very philosophical. But if we are going from the angle of biology, or let's say from chemistry or from physics, we need to understand essentially what does cognition actually mean, right? So in my definition, the cognition, what it means is it encompasses these functions of the brain, including emotion, attention and executive function, speech and language, and even higher order processing like memory, and finally that leads to decision making. Now in the next slide I will show you some example of that, which will probably help you to understand these even better. I think all of you recognize the batsman who is over there, Sachin Tendulkar. We have heard a lot about cricket. We are cricket loving nation, right? I also watch cricket. I also love cricket. But cricket is a very complex game. It's not such a simple game. It requires a lot of coordination between different muscle groups, which actually kind of results in driving certain neurons which are located in those motor area that I showed you 2 slides back, right? দুটো স্লাইড আগে তোমাদের যে মোটর এরিয়া দেখালাম, সেই মোটর এরিয়াকে অনেকগুলো এরিয়ার সাথে কোঅর্ডিনেট করতে হয় in order to kind of arrive at coordination and decision making during a cricket ball that needs to be hit in a certain direction, right? Okay, so it requires sensory processing, it requires motor coordination, and in this case, since we are moving both hands, it's also called bimanual coordination. Okay, we have to move our feet, so we need to move the feet in a certain direction in which we will hit the ball, and also like execution of the shot, right? So all these together is what is known as decision making, right? Which is actually apparently looks very easy, but if you break it down into small modules, you understand that each of these goes through several processing stages, which requires the neurons to understand the input that they are going to process internally and what is going to come from external environment, right? Okay. This also is very interesting example of the same thing which we just showed in the previous slide. যখন আমরা ছোট থেকে বড় হই, we have all observed these. Those who have kids in the house, they know it very well. And some of us actually can directly relate to these, right? We have seen a baby to, raise their head or lift their head at certain age in months, and then they slowly roll over, then they sit without parental support, then they start crawling, right? So all these process may look very much evolutionarily encoded in our gene, but each of the child, if you watch them, they go through this process till they start standing alone or walking alone in their individual unique way. So there is a unique trajectory during the developmental ages and developmental change. Now we try to understand during normal healthy development versus during atypical development, that is basically children who are suffering from attention hyperactivity disorder or autism spectrum disorder. How do they actually lose their ability to carry out these kind of functions, and why there is a late development of these functions in their brain? Okay. Now comes the question that all these things are very good, what you told us. আমি এগুলো সব বুঝতে পেরেছি, আপনি যেগুলো বলছেন, হ্যাঁ, but what is actually the approach or way we can understand these problems more from the mechanism point of view, right? What are the underlying mechanisms? Because after all, we are all scientists and we are trying to understand, and we are not only happy with what we see in the behavior, but we want to understand that if we can explain the behavior, it will be something which will be really, really good, right? Now, before we go to that, we can actually discuss some of these pioneering studies which has done by different groups who are working with babies, right? And they are baby labs, and there what they said exactly what I told in the last slide, right? That every child themselves is a scientist, is not a data analyst, right? So I love this term, right? They are scientists, they are not data analysts. So if you ask a child to, learn gravity, right? They learn the principles of gravity at a very early age. By the time they reach about like 10 months or 11 months, they already know that a car can be like going down, but not coming up, right? So the knowledge of these, which gets hardwired, right, in the brain, it actually develops with the progression of the age. And then they learn essentially this abstract learning, what we call, which allows us to find out cause and effect, right? There is a cause and there is an effect, right? We know that the car will fall on the floor if it is dropped from a height. So therefore, even though child may not know Newton's equations of motion, the child still knows what is gravity. Similarly, a child or a baby knows actually when things moves on a incline, right, or a slider, and how the properties of mechanics actually change when the car come in contact with the floor, right? So all these properties is the knowledge, right? That knowledge and intelligence essentially grows as we develop, as we more develop, and eventually it reaches a threshold or a age where their learning is actually complete, right? Okay. And if you look at the modern day artificial intelligence and machine learning, they are really investing a lot of energy and effort in order to understand how child learns to acquire these functions which I have just now mentioned. Now, in our lab, what we are interested in, we are not interested in developing these individual models only of the brain to track development in the children, but we also do some kind of abstract network analysis because we think that the neurons are interconnected network which has this kind of neuron located here in the brain in a given brain area which is interacting with another neuron in that area and another neuron in that area, and that neuron is also interacting with the neuron which is spatially confined into their own modules and own specialized area. So for example, these may be visual area or these may be motor area, and these may be visual area and these may be frontal brain area and these may be motor brain area, but they are constantly in coordination with each other in order to acquire and learn complex tasks, right? Be it a motor task or be it even more complex tasks than motor tasks, right? So when you become more developed, you acquire these functions. These functions in neuroscience are called executive functions, where you know when there is something which need to be opened, like a door of the room, you actually open it with certain amount of force, and then essentially the door location, you memorize the door location. You don't actually try to open a door that is not possible to open, right? So these kind of functions you develop based on a very principled interaction between these brain areas, and this principle of interaction between these brain areas can be actually decoded based on the network of neurons, how they communicate with each other as we develop. Okay, that is the view that I am putting over here. So when you are starting your journey into this world and you are very young, যখন তোমরা খুব ছোট, ধরো 1 বছর বয়স বা 2 বছর বয়স, preschool children's, right? That time your brain is not so organized. There is only a little bit of trace of these modules, but as you move on and as you develop, there is more and more specialization, and the connection within those specialized areas become strengthened as you become older, right? And therefore you acquire certain types of skills which allow you to process the sensory stimuli as well as carry out cognitive processings like the one I told you earlier about emotion or memory and etc. etc. But again, when you become aged, most of these things sort of loosely speaking fall apart, right? Because those connections get weakened, and as you become older, right, it gets further weakened, and eventually it comes to a point when the network becomes more salt and pepper, meaning the network structure actually gets disintegrated. So we study these brain networks, which is behind those concepts that I have already introduced to you, including memory, attention, language, perception, and cognitive processing. And each of these processes is an involvement of unique set of brain networks that communicate with each other through their neurons and sending out certain electrical and chemical signals and passing information to each other. এবং তাদের এই যে ইন্টারাকশনের বেসিসে তারা কোনো স্পেসিফিক মেমোরি অ্যাকোয়ার করে, তাদের সেটা অবজেক্টের মেমোরি হোক বা কোনো ফোন নাম্বার মনে রাখতে হোক বা কোনো ওয়ার্ড মনে রাখতে হোক বা কোনো সেন্টেন্স মনে রাখতে হোক, or if when you have to navigate, just like you see Google map on your phone sometimes, in order to go from one city to another city or one location in the city to another location, similarly brain have those neurons which are just like their GPS system, right, which allow them to track the location, collect the information about the space and time, and process it and learn through these networks. And this is one of the reasons why many of the people who are actually in the AI community, they are very interested in understanding how human brain networks processes these functions and whether it is possible to replicate this function in the machines. Now that brings us to history a little bit, just as a diversion from my talk, but it is important diversion to talk about like Ramoni Kahal, who is one of the pioneer of this network view of the brain, right? Who, who didn't have a microscope in his time when he was doing neuroscience research, and সেই সময়ে তার কাছে ছিল কতগুলো স্কেচ বুক। ওর হাতে নিউরনের যে মরফোলজি সেটাকে ও হাতে অ্যাকচুয়ালি লিখে রেখেছিল। তো তার ফলে ও যখন ডিফারেন্ট নিউরনের কনসেপচুয়ালাইজ করছে অ্যাজ এ নেটওয়ার্ক, তখন he was thinking about each of these neurons have different kind of structure, arborization, dendrites, then cell body like soma or nucleus of the neurons, and then you can see basically these long fiber, right, just like electrical cable, which is sending out information from one end to the other end, right? Okay, and then when they are interconnected, there is a long set of processes. These processes are very very important karon ei process er through te you can recognize somebody's face or you cannot recognize somebody's face in case those neurons are damaged, and some other neurons has to take over that function, which is also called neurocompensation. So he identified and discovered many different types of cells. Okay, each of those cells have their own importance. So therefore there is a conclusion that the networks are present at every scale of the human brain organization, and if you have the right technique and methods, you should be able to identify them. Now you can see that in this multi-scale spatial organization of the brain anatomy, that you have the neurons organization at the 100 micron level. Then you can also see it even smaller unit of spatial scales, and when you go into the highest unit of spatial scale, you sort of see the whole brain, right? Whole brain, which is like about 10 centimeter in terms of the width. And then you see the sulci and gyri, which are basically brain structures, which are also called in plain simple term brain folds, right? These folds are about like, let's say 1 centimeter each. Now because of this spatial organization, which is multiple scales, the solutions that you actually see from these spatial scales, they are also give you very rich processing, very rich information processing at various scales of biology. And therefore I tried to summarize these in this way, where you have a cellular interactions through this network, which is called microscale or labeled as microscale. Then second scale is mesoscale, where functional interactions are between brain regions, right? Okay, which is sometimes evolutionarily conserved, meaning you see the same kind of organization in other animals, not just only in humans, and these can change over development or lifespan, which we call change with time, or it can change topologically, meaning different networks are connected with other neurons in other brain areas, and because of their connections you can have different repertoire of cognitive functions. And then in the macro scale level, where you have cognitive systems actually, right? Brain areas like visual systems, motor systems, this is happening at a much larger spatial scale. Just like in the previous slide you saw, those scales even can span like 10 centimeter, right? Okay, now if you look at the major methods that we use in our lab and also by all other labs in the world, they can span many sizes. they can actually give you a resolution in the order of 0.0001 millimeter, which is at the level of the single synapse, which is the unit, biological unit that connects two neurons, right? Or it can give you a resolution of dendrites. So a lot of people nowadays work on dendrite computation, dendrite level processing. Then it can go all the way to the brain level, which is most interesting level for my techniques, the ones I use at the level of these. And you may ask me the question that why are you not working on this level? The answer is we can, but one lab cannot do every type of work, right? Which becomes actually a very arduous and gigantic task. But we can learn from other people's work, what they are finding in this scale and what we are finding in this scale. Do they actually matches? If those discovery matches, যদি দুটো ফাইন্ডিং ম্যাচ করে, then I think that would be a fantastic thing, right? Because we should be able to measure brain function and activity at various spatial scale. And similarly, when we go across the time dimension or time axis, we can measure them at the millisecond interval, মানে মিলিসেকেন্ডের যে ইউনিট তাতে, অথবা we can go all the way to minutes, hours, day or month, right? Because we can ask somebody who is suffering with some memory problem, we look at their brain images right now, and we can call them after 1 year follow up, and we can ask them after 1 year, how is your brain doing? Then after another 1 year, we can ask them, how is your brain doing now, right? So in this process, which is known as in biology longitudinal studies, we can follow up somebody, and we can see when they are crossing middle age to getting into old age, how specifically these neural networks and their activities change. Now, what are those activities? Because till now I have not talked about those activities at all, and I just wanted to take a break from the talk to ask if you have, before I go into the functional activities of the brain, I just wanted to take a break and ask if anybody has any question at this point.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. One student had asked a question that, sir, what is Alzheimer's dementia in young stage?
Okay. I can answer that question. And I can tell you that Alzheimer's and dementia, these প্রিডমিনেন্টলি এই যে প্যাথোলজিগুলো রয়েছে বা এই যে কন্ডিশনসগুলো রয়েছে, এগুলো ডেভেলপড হওয়ার জন্যে তোমার অনেকটা সময় লাগে। তো at a young age, finding dementia would be relatively sparse. Okay, so even if you find somebody, they may have reached something like 45 years or 50 years, because typically যে ডেটা আমরা ব্রেনে দেখি different সাবজেক্টের থেকে, we see there is a critical age. After that critical age is crossed, only then you start seeing memory impairment like frontotemporal dementia or mild cognitive impairment like MCI. And you don't find that too often in a 25 years old or 30 years old, unless if that person has some kind of a surgery, right, for epilepsy or other kind of mrigi rog, jetake amra boli epilepsy, or those kind of like, surgery in the brain in specific location of the brain, which is responsible for this kind of early neurodegeneration. So if the neurodegeneration start early, then only you will start seeing those kind of memory impairment problem in those individuals. Otherwise, when you are looking at the population and deriving some sample from the population and looking at those samples, predominantly you find somebody who get into those kind of problems of memory impairment maybe around late 50 years or so. Okay, আমি জানি না যে আমি উত্তরটা দিতে পারলাম কিনা ও যেটা জিজ্ঞেস করছিল।
একদম স্যার। আমরা স্নেহার থেকেও আর একটা কোয়েশ্চেন পেয়েছি। তার আগে অ্যাকচুয়ালি আমার নিজের একটা কোয়েশ্চেন আছে। I cannot actually resist to ask you. Actually, sir,
Please. I think the talk is not a monologue. The talk is for interaction, so it is
yes,
absolutely
sir.
welcome. Yeah?
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. Actually, I was going to the slide where you showed that the youth and the adult, the stages of the neurodevelopment. Now,
Right.
Is it the neurodevelopment a lifelong process, or it stops after a certain age, or it is specifically based on the perception of the situations which happen lifelong? So, what is it? The neurodevelopment if it stops?
Right. It is a খুব important question. So the reason we get also into those memory impairment or other type of impairment, right, as
Yes.
we become older, is because the neurons do not multiply and like generate new neurons, right? Okay.
Yes.
That said, there is neurocompensation. তার মানে হচ্ছে যে নিউরো ডেভেলপমেন্ট এক জায়গাতে গিয়ে স্টপ হয়ে যায়, and then after that there is a protruded development. Okay, so you don't see further any more development that is happening. ঠিক আছে, কিন্তু যখন কেউ মিডল এজ রিচ করে from young age, you start seeing opposite of what was happening
Yes.
at a very early days or during maturation.
Definitely.
So then the development stops, but the changes continues to happen in the brain, right?
Yes.
Okay, so there is no further development, but there is a lot of reorganization.
Okay.
And this reorganization sometimes for good and sometimes for bad. Okay. Yes.
Yes, sir.
So
Definitely.
is that a way to answer that question?
Yes. So, as a conclusive statement, can we say that the neurodevelopment stops at a particular age, and what neurodevelopment has started, it goes on with the reorganizing itself? It may be for good or bad, but it reorganizes continuously.
Absolutely. That's what more and more evidence is suggesting, that's precisely what is happening in the brain.
Yes.
And that gives us an opportunity that is there a way to get back to the new normal, essentially.
Definitely.
Right?
That
Okay.
I was asking.
And is there a intervention technique or a medical intervention technique that allow you to kind of see certain type of biomarkers or changes
Right.
which actually can make the brain go in a trajectory that is actually healthy for the brain, right? Okay.
Yes.
So that it can sustain function for a continued period, okay, even at a late age.
Yes.
And the second question actually which you had, which was also a very interesting question, that whether there is neuroplasticity. Neuroplasticity means that আমি যদি একরকম ভাবে আমার ব্রেনকে ট্রেন করি,
Right.
can it shape up the functions
Definitely.
and functional processing in certain way, as opposed to if I train my brain in any other way, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes.
So I think lot of these things, as I showed in my slide where I was showing this baby development, right? The way they essentially crawl and then eventually stand up without any support, right? This is a learned behavior, right?
Yes.
This behavior is learned through interaction with their immediate environment.
Definitely.
And if they learned it in any different way during those golden period or golden window, right? When they are able to learn the maximum, right? They would have learned it probably in another type of way. They would have, still, nonetheless, they would have acquired function like this, right? Motor function like this.
Yes. I think some extent there is plasticity, but although it is controlled.
Absolutely. We call it cortical plasticity. And when I was working in MIT, actually in my postdoc lab, they also showed these happening in the mouse brain, these neuroplasticity.
Yes.
And they have also shown that certain neurons which are like, specialized, as I was showing, as you develop, you acquire certain specialization. So certain neurons which is specialized for one kind of functions, these neurons can be trained to do another type of functions. Okay, you just have to find the right period during the animal development post birth, right? And you probably can start this process very early and engineer the neurons to
Yes.
learn and acquire certain functions
Yeah.
which can actually, which typically, like, the neurons are not known to do, right? Okay.
Yes.
So
Yes.
for example, a visual neuron, which is good for vision, right?
Yes.
And that neuron can learn some auditory processing as well.
Definitely.
Because
That I was talking.
after all, auditory signals and visual signals are not too different from each other in terms of their electrical and chemical properties. Right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Actually, sir, while teaching, we tell it as psychomotor skills because
Correct.
while teaching, both the things are actually getting coordinated, as you showed in the
Correct.
say, cricket
Correct.
example.
Correct.
I would say. And one quick question I cannot resist myself to ask, then we'll be going into Sneha's. I have heard something which is flight and fight, considering a particular situation. So,
Right.
what are the stimulations or what are the changes associated with that? Are there any neuro things related to the flight and fight mode? Because many individuals behave in a
So
different way.
we don't actually put, like, the question or the research question in that way.
Yes.
আমরা যেটা করি আর কি, রিসার্চ কোয়েশ্চেনটাকে আমরা ফ্রেম করি on a same thing. Essentially we say competition versus cooperation.
Yes.
So
That's the best way of saying.
right, so some neurons actually seems to cooperate with each other. Okay.
Yes.
And Gerald Edelman, who is a Nobel laureate actually, who has passed away back, had a theory which is called neural Darwinism, right?
Okay.
So he said, like, some neurons will survive, they will have these winner take all kind of scenarios.
Yes.
And these neurons will be competing with other neuron for resources as well, right? And these neurons will, like, carry out as a winner majority of those functions, right? Okay.
Yes.
And then there will be scenarios of functions or complex functions in which a set of neuron or a subset of neurons cannot do that function alone, right? And there, like, let's say a scenario like a visuomotor coordination, right? যেখানে আমি বলছিলাম যে আমি টেবিল থেকে একটা জলের গ্লাস তুলে মুখের কাছে নিয়ে যাওয়ার জন্য there has to be two specialized areas of the brain or neurons that need to cooperate with each other.
Yes.
Okay. Like, for example, if the visual neurons are not cooperating with motor neurons, then we don't know what should be the trajectory of the glass and with how much speed we need to, like, make the glass come closer to the mouth, otherwise জল পড়ে যাবে, right? যে জিনিসটা হয় হচ্ছে যখন আমরা জল খেতে যাই গাড়িতে, রাইট? গাড়ির যখন একটা স্পিড থাকে নিজের কাইনামেটিক্স, তখন আমাদের ওটার সাথে অ্যাডাপ্ট করতে হয় বা অ্যাডজাস্ট করতে হয় ওই স্পিডের সাথে in order to have it. So we need to know the location of the bottle. So if we are blindfolded, it would be very difficult for us to do that task, right? Then we have to rely on other two senses, that is tactile, মানে আমাদের টাচ সেন্স এবং আমাদের মোটর রেসপন্স, রাইট? Okay. So I think to answer your question briefly is, I think there are scenarios which facilitate competition between the group of neurons, and there are scenarios in which you don't actually fight, okay, but you actually, like, flight, right? Scenarios, and you let the other specialized compartments or unit to take over that job, right?
Yes.
Okay.
Yes, sir. Yeah, I think Sneha can just unmute herself. She wants to ask. She's the student. Sneha,
Sure.
are we audible to you?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah, you can just ask your question to sir.
So I have two questions. First is what are the potential strategies for preventing age-related memory decline and neurodegenerative disease, just like the Alzheimer disease, Parkinson disease, these types of disease? And my second question is the depressions, anxiety, overthinking especially affects the structure in the human brain or any types of neurons?
Right. So first question that you asked about Parkinson disease and Alzheimer's disease, okay, and interventional techniques. Okay, so lot of the current literature and findings, including what we find in our lab, actually, uh, it really depends on what are the specific type of impairments, right? The predominant impairment, that does not mean that there are no other impairments, but the predominant impairment in the case of Alzheimer's disease is, of course, memory impairment, right? Okay. And in the case of like Parkinson disease, which is a neurological disorder, not necessarily a neurodegenerative disorder, which relates to gating problems, motor problems, like bradykinesia, and also like tremors, right? Tremors. Now, these two problems are completely two different type of problems, right? Where there are, when you look at Parkinson disease, it's more like a timing related problem. So you want to use some kind of techniques nowadays used, although they are very expensive technique till now, which are called deep brain stimulation. So you introduce a pacemaker like device when you have a heart problem or like arrhythmia. You introduce an artificial device, right, like pacemaker, in order to make sure that the heart rate variability and the cardiac cycle is actually going normally. Similarly, during Parkinson disease, you can introduce these deep brain stimulation techniques, which is a small electrical device that you actually implant through surgery in some locations, something close to the chest, where actually neurosurgeon put is inside the brain to an area which is below cortical areas. What I was showing in my talks is all cortical areas. We are not talking about the other set of areas which are subcortical areas. So these are below the cortical areas at a certain depth of the brain, because the brain has different layers which are, as you saw in my talk also, has different spatial scales. So when you apply these deep brain stimulation in the patients, you see for the duration to which this can be charged with a battery. And when the DBS works, in most of the clinics where DBS is used for treatment, they stop this Parkinsonian tremor simply because now the neurons are relaying their information in terms of an electrical signal which is reaching the other neurons right on time at which it should have gone, right? And there is no latency. Latency means delay in terms of the information going from one brain area to the target brain area, right?
Definitely.
Okay. However, if you want to solve it chemically, right, there are change in the dopamine level, dopamine concentrations, and you know there are medicines called L-dopa and levodopa and
Yes.
others, which actually tries to change these dopamine levels in order to see whether that has an impact in the uh, reduction of some kind of functional abnormalities that you see during the Parkinson patients, right? However, till now, there are gaps in the clinical solutions, and what has been generally observed, which is related to the Parkinsonian symptoms, and there is no full fledged solution in the market as of now. Okay, either the solution is very expensive, not affordable to, like, common man, and or you have some solution which is like a stopgap solution but doesn't go into the root of the problem. Okay, yeah.
Yes.
But as we speak, there are laboratories in India itself who are doing excellent work, okay, including Samir Maji from IIT Bombay Bioscience Bioengineering Department, who actually works on the molecular pathways of the Parkinson disease patients. And they are also developing some techniques and methods which can go into clinical trials. Okay, so there are promises, good promises. For Alzheimer's disease, the problem is much more critical. Okay, and as of now, whether you use a non-invasive technique or whether you use some other techniques, you can only talk about specific mechanisms uh, which can be sort of addressed or arrested at an early stage when the participant or the patient has not fully developed Alzheimer's, but the patient has something which is mild form of cognitive impairment, which is also called MCI, right? Mild cognitive impairment. And you can kind of slow down the process of getting into Alzheimer's, right?
Yes.
One of the findings, which is from NIMHANS Bangalore by Suvarna Aladi's group, they have actually showed, because India is a multilingual country, and bilinguals, most of the people, or maybe trilingual. So therefore, these language areas and their specialization can delay the process of onset of Alzheimer's at least to good 5 to 10 years. Okay, because of the executive functions again. Okay, that is very encouraging, because if you use more language skills, if you use more cognitive skills, if you engage yourself into many kind of those functions, then your brain can stay healthy for a longer period of time. Okay, that's what these studies suggesting.
Yes.
In terms of the molecular side, there are already drugs which has been developed in UK and also FDA approved in USA in different labs, which I get to hear from my colleagues and friends and other people, which is been also in the news like BBC and others, where they have tried it out during clinical trials in patients who have not a very severe stage of Alzheimer's, but an early stage of Alzheimer's. And it seems to actually work to arrest these problems of amyloid beta precursors, which is one of the molecules, right, which sort of deposits in the specific area of the brain that controls for the memory functions and processing, right? Okay. So if you reduce those quantities, or if you don't allow the plaque, these are called plaques because these molecules actually forms an extended version which sort of get deposited in those areas. So if you can remove them and clean up the brain in some sort of way based on molecular interventions, it may be possible. But then most of the clinical trials actually are going on in animal models. To take these from animal models to the human models is another set of challenge, okay, which will probably occupy science for at least not, if not for 100 years, at least for another 50 years. Right?
Yes, yes. Yeah, Sneha, I think you have got a very good answer, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah.
My second question is the depression and anxiety affects in the structure of human brain or in the functions of human brain?
Oh, yes, of course. I mean, it can do both, actually. It can alter the, it can introduce structural changes, but structural changes are typically happening over a slow time scale. It takes a lot of time to change the structures, which are, as you saw during the development, the brain gets wired in a certain way. And then changing that structure requires a tremendous amount of perturbations in the brain. So then only the structure changes. But function-wise, there is a huge amount of change when it comes to this type of scenarios. Okay? Yeah.
Okay, sir.
Maybe I'll move on if you don't mind, so that I can also show you what do we mean by some functions.
Yes, yes, definitely. Actually, the session is so interesting, sir. And
Yes.
we cannot resist asking, going on.
Oh, no problem. No problem.
Yes, sir. Yes,
So
sir.
these are some of the electrical signals which you see in the form of oscillatory activities or oscillations when the membrane is excited or the neurons are excited. And when you are relaxing, like meditation or something like this, you see a ripple like this, which is more like in the form of certain bouts or time windows over which you see a very uh, fast spiking activity of the neurons, followed by a silent period, and then again followed by lot of like burst like activity or spiking activity of the neurons. Whereas when you are in the sleep state, you are not in the awake state, you kind of see these slow, very, very slow oscillations, which are sort of like ultra slow if we look at the time scale which is plotted next to it, right? And the size of these potentials are typically like about 50 microvolts or 60 microvolts, which is also measurable through an amplifier, and you can record those oscillatory activities from functional brain networks. When you do imaging, which we did, these are our data from one participants, where you kind of see these fluctuations which are going on in the brain. When you have asked the participants not to move inside the scanner, and I think some of you may have seen a MRI scanner, at least in picture or somewhere in hospital facilities. I hope nobody goes to hospital. We don't put people in hospitals. We did these recordings in NBRC, and because it has a scanner, and we use these for the purpose of our experiments to learn more about the brain function, right? So here you can see the brain areas which are showing two kinds of activity. Either they are very, very highly correlated, like more like these red, you know, sign, or the red, what do you call, uh, change in the positive change in the voltage, which are highly positively sort of like correlated here, or they are highly negatively correlated, right? And otherwise, most of the brain areas, as you can see, are in green, right? Which kind of suggests that there is practically no correlation about these areas. They are more like noise, right? There is nothing which is happening over here in these areas. And the beauty of these is you can look at these at the whole brain level, because if you record from one single neuron, তুমি যদি একটা নিউরন, দুটো নিউরন, তিনটে নিউরন থেকে রেকর্ড করো, so you only can get an understanding of how the neurons are responding to the task or the stimulus. But here you can see it for the whole brain. So therefore there is an advantage of seeing how whole brain is responding or reacting to that situation. And you can keep on doing these, and you can see basically these activities changes even during different type of task, like let's say cognition, perception, executive functions. So therefore you can map the brain areas and see how their functions are actually altering in real time, right? To look at basically the brain activity of a group of neurons located in a specific brain area. It could be visual area, auditory area, then motor area, as I described before. Now, if you take a snapshot of these, then what you get is shown over here in magnification. You can see there is very high value where two brain regions are communicating with each other. They are highly correlated with each other, or they have low correlation where they are not actually like, connected or communicating with each other that much, okay, from these networks. So once we understand these open up a new opportunity for us to do brain mapping for various type of tasks, both in healthy condition and also in the disease condition. So we published some of this work early in 2020, where we showed that there are so many brain areas that can be mapped, which are functionally connected with each other, and they are constantly communicating with each other, whether there is a stimulus present or not present. Okay, that means whether you are closing your eyes, whether your eyes are open, you are processing your world, right? Whether you do that or not do that, there is some kind of ignition which is happening in the brain areas, so much so that you can map the visual areas, which we use for processing visual objects. We are use these for recognizing color, perceiving colors, blue color, white color, red color, different types of colors, different wavelengths. We also use these for understanding faces of people, right? Whether these faces of my teacher or whether this is a face of a student, right? Or we can actually think about if this area is actually damaged, which is the case for, like, people who are congenitally blind, right? Like whose sight has lost, who are visually not sighted. You may ask the interesting question, what happens to their visual area? Do they also light up? Do they also get activated? What happens to their neurons? Do they also, like, function like normal sighted individuals? And similarly, you can see the auditory areas, that the way we process the sounds of the world, there is an activation which is coming from the left auditory area and the right auditory area, and both are highly activated when you are processing sound that is coming from a movie, whether sound that is coming from a music, or whether this is coming just from a conversation of two individuals like you are hearing me right now. And most likely that's the same area of the brain for all of you is actually activated. When you look at if you forget about the location where this is activated, but you are more interested about time, that in time, how much oxygen is taken up by the neurons in this area. And if you plot the blood level oxygen that goes into the cerebral cortex or those areas, you can see the oxygen's fluctuation in time. And this oxygen, which rises and falls in a continuous fashion over this time duration from each of these brain areas, is a proxy to the neuronal firing patterns, the way neurons actually gets recruited and activated, and they require more and more oxygen supply and metabolism, obviously, in order to function. Now, we now have a map, therefore, between function or functional brain areas, which are activated specifically with the environment or the stimulus, and their relationship to the underlying anatomy, which we have seen in our which we have seen in our first few slides, which I talked about during the architecture or morphology of the neurons in the brain, right? Structural organization of the brain. Now, structure, whether it fully mapped to the function, that we don't know. That's actually is a very, very open question. But if we look at these in other animals and ask the same question, that in an animal like nematode, like C. elegans, or fruit flies, which is called Drosophila, or human brain, or like chimpanzee or non-human primates like macaque monkeys, do we see the same organization or do we see a different organization? The very interesting finding is that you see the same organization at a gross or a crude level, no matter which methodology you are using, whether you are using histology, which is a technique to map the underlying neuronal properties and structure, or whether you use, instead of histology, imaging data, and you do anatomical kind of parcellation of the brain into different landmarks, you find the anatomy and the functions depicted by these electrical changes and fluctuation coming from salient brain areas or specific brain areas, যেখান থেকে তুমি রেকর্ডিং করছো, সেই এরিয়াগুলোতে যদি তুমি ইলেকট্রোড বসাও এবং ওই সাইটগুলো থেকে রেকর্ডিং করো, তাহলে দেখা যাচ্ছে যে অ্যানাটমিক্যালি তুমি যে ওয়্যারিং গুলো পেয়েছো ব্রেন এরিয়াসে বা নিউরন গুলোর মধ্যে, সেই ওয়্যারিং গুলো somewhere converges with the functional brain networks. So therefore, structural changes and structural organization of the neurons seems to map to functional organization of the brain areas, except functional organization is happening on a much faster time scale as compared to structural changes. And as I said, also to the answer to that very interesting question. And therefore, the functional changes can be more spontaneous, meaning it may happen day to day, it may happen hour to hour, it can happen minute to minute, or it can even happen milliseconds to milliseconds. On the other hand, structural organization don't change so fast. It takes time because some of the structural pathways and connections are evolutionarily conserved across species. And that brings us to a very interesting functional question. How does the brain solve visual object recognition? Which was the question which one of my teacher, actually James D. Carlo, when I was in US for my PhD, who taught us some courses, actually asked very recently, not too recently, 12 years now, how does the brain solve the visual object recognition? So when we look at the structure again, we see these are the fibers. This is how brain areas are connected, right? Okay. And we see there are two pathways in which the information can travel, right? From primary visual areas. One, which is actually goes into the, this pathway, which is reaching the frontal part of the brain from the visual area. Visual area is always at the back of the brain. Eyes collects information from the environment based on the light properties, and there is something which we know in our eyes which are known as rod cells and cone cells. They also process informations, and then they absorb certain things about the light, and then there is retinal ganglion cells or retina, which projects these information to the primary visual area. Okay, and then visual area send these information to higher areas of the brain. So therefore brain is extremely hierarchical, and in some studies in neuroscience, they have called these where pathway. That means when I am processing some sound or stimuli, we are basically asking where is the sound located, and then the second question we are asking, what is the sound, right? Okay, what kind of sound is it? So this pathway sometimes is called what pathway in the brain, or in other words, it's called ventral pathway, and this path is called dorsal pathway. And why this is interesting, I will tell you in another 5 minutes, and I will probably close my talk. Then you can ask me as many questions as you want. Okay? Yeah. So in these two pathways, some magic happens, right? And that is very, very interesting. That's been a fertile ground for many discoveries, including a Nobel Prize by Hubel and Wiesel, who got the Nobel Prize in Physiology actually for their discoveries. And very interestingly, when Jim DiCarlo and others actually did this experiment at MIT, they found that our brain can distinguish between what is elephant, what is shorts, what is bird, what is tank, what is camel, and so on and so forth. So basically, our brain is an object recognition machine, right? It can do all kinds of object recognition, no matter whatever is the orientation of the object. Okay? So if the object is oriented by different angles, it does not matter. Human can do the same task. And monkey or non-human primates can also do the same task. Okay? So therefore, you can train a lot of neural networks or like machine learning models to learn actually this kind of classification, right? Okay, how do you classify between a dog and a spider, or a spider and a truck, or table and a calculator? And brain actually has this amazing capability of segregation or specialization for object recognition, and at the same time generalization. Take an example, right? তোমরা সবাই ক্লাসে যাও, ক্লাসে গিয়ে তোমরা প্রতিদিন চেয়ারে বসো, হ্যাঁ, কিন্তু তোমাদের যদি একটা অন্য কোনো শেপের চেয়ার দেখানো হয় ওখানে, বা চেয়ারটার কালার যদি বদলে যায়, তুমি ওই চেয়ারটাকে টেবিল বলো না, তুমি স্টিল ওই চেয়ারটাকে চেয়ার বলো। তার মানে ব্রেন আলাদা করে চেয়ারের জন্য কোনো মানে স্পেশাল লেবেল দেয় না। চেয়ার একটাই, চেয়ারের শেপ, চেয়ারটা কিরকম দেখতে হয় সেটা ব্রেন মনে রাখে, এবং ব্রেন জেনারেলাইজ করে অ্যাক্রস অল টাইপস অফ চেয়ার্স। ওকে, only time brain will say this is a table যখন একটা টেবিল তাকে দেখানো হবে, রাইট? Okay, so the brain knows how to segregate information, and they also know how to generalize information and integrate information. So if we look at the full circuit of the brain, then we can see there is ventral pathway যেখান দিয়ে ইনফরমেশন এরকম ভাবে যায়, dorsal pathway which is bidirectional কারণ দুদিকেই অ্যারো রয়েছে, which is bidirectional. Then you have motor area which communicate with the visual area through this area called V5, which is a higher order visual area, which actually is important for looking at the motion direction of stimulus. Okay, একটা ফাস্ট মুভিং কার ভার্সেস একটা স্লো মুভিং কার, এই দুটোর মধ্যে আমরা ডিস্টিংগুইশ করতে পারি বিকজ there are neurons in this area which has this special ability in order to distinguish between different, motion objects, right? And then that communicates with this area called parietal cortex, jeta ei information take process kore in order to allow people to make a decision about what is an elephant versus what is a shorts, or what is a knife versus what is a gun, or different types of knives, right? So these kind of differences come from this area called inferior temporal cortex, or in short it is called IT cortex. This area has been shown both in human and also in non-human primates like monkeys, that this is the area they uses in order to solve the visual object recognition. Now this is a Nature Neuroscience paper. If somebody is interested, they can look at actually this paper. And in this paper, they also talk about how does the machine solves this visual object recognition. And they developed some kind of machine learning models to train the brain networks to exhibit these properties. And what it turns out, just like I was saying, that you have retina, then the information go like a feed forward, not feedback, right? Feed forward to these LGN. And that is exactly what you see in the human brain also. So which means that there is feed forward connections, and LGN থেকে projection হয় হচ্ছে primary visual area তে, then primary visual থেকে secondary visual areas এ, then higher order visual areas এ, and then IT cortex come into this picture. The way brain decodes and labels object categories, exactly the same way today's artificial neural networks actually can do this kind of object recognition, except for the fact ব্রেনের অনেক কম এনার্জি লাগে, ব্রেনের অনেক কম এক্সাম্পল লাগে অবজেক্টকে ক্যাটেগরাইজ করার জন্য, whereas a machine requires a huge amount of energy which is actually can drain out the budget of a government. And secondly, the machine learning kind of models or AI models requires lots of training data, right? So if you have only few training data, they will miserably fail. Whereas brain does not require too many, training data. They can learn actually from few examples, and that is more than sufficient for the brain to generalize. যেটা আমি বললাম চেয়ারের example দিয়ে. Now what we did is, beyond this visual object recognition, we also looked at auditory processing. So auditory processing, আমরা একজন পার্টিসিপেন্টের লেফট ইয়ারে একটা সাউন্ড ইন্ট্রোডিউস করেছিলাম, রাইট ইয়ারে একটা সাউন্ড ইন্ট্রোডিউস করেছিলাম, এবং দুটো ইয়ারে এই সাউন্ড ইন্ট্রোডিউস করেছিলাম। আমাদের হাইপোথিসিস কি ছিল? আমাদের হাইপোথিসিস ছিল বোঝার যে যদি আমরা সাউন্ড লেফট ইয়ারে বা রাইট ইয়ারে দিই, তাহলে ব্রেনের যে নেটওয়ার্কগুলো রয়েছে অডিটরি এরিয়াতে, সেই নেটওয়ার্কগুলোর মধ্যে কিছুটা এসিমেট্রি দেখা যাবে কিনা, মানে লেফট ব্রেন ভার্সেস রাইট ব্রেনের যে ডিবেট রয়েছে, হ্যাঁ, সেটাকে সামহাও রিজলভ করা যাবে কিনা। খুব ইন্টারেস্টিংলি দেখা গেল যে বাইনরাল স্টিমুলি, মানে দুটো কানেই যখন তুমি সাউন্ড টোন প্রডিউস করছো, তখন তুমি যদি ইনফরমেশন পাথওয়েটাকে দেখো ব্রেনে, তাহলে তুমি দেখতে পাবে যে ব্রেনের ইনফরমেশন পাথওয়ে স্টিল ফেভার্স right hemisphere as opposed to left hemisphere. এবং because of this favoring of right hemisphere, there is a asymmetry that is introduced while processing auditory information. এবং এইটার একটা মিডিয়া কভারেজ হয়েছিল ইন্ডিয়া সায়েন্স ওয়ারে, যেখানে ওরা লিখেছিল যে this is first study from India where people have actually found physiological and functional origin underlying hemispheric asymmetry in music and speech perception, right? মানে একটা ব্রেনের সাইড মিউজিকের জন্য খুব তোমার এপ্ট, কারণ মিউজিক ইজ ভেরি মেলোডিয়াস, রেগুলার অ্যান্ড এভরিথিং। আরেকটা হয়তো খুব রেগুলার নয়, which the sound or the tone which is coming with some amount of noise, then brain other hemisphere is more apt in processing that. So that is very interesting. And last thing that I will talk about, it's a very interesting point of time in society, because our society, just like Western society, আমাদেরও সোসাইটির লোকেদের এজ হচ্ছে। So as we become older, there will be more and more this type of problem, যেগুলো তোমরা ডিসকাশনের সময় ডিসকাস করছিলে, like Parkinson disease, like Alzheimer's disease, like dementia. So the question is, if we don't talk about memory related problems, but if we instead ask something else that is related to age এর সাথে সাথে কি করে আমাদের ইমোশন প্রসেসিং চেঞ্জ হয়, আমরা যখন বৃদ্ধ হয়ে যায় তখন ইমোশনাল প্রসেসিং কি একই রকম থাকে, আলাদা থাকে? অ্যান্ড ইমোশনাল প্রসেসিং ইজ ভেরি ইম্পর্টেন্ট টু আন্ডারস্ট্যান্ড ফ্রম মেন্টাল হেলথ পয়েন্ট অফ ভিউ। তাই আমাদের ল্যাব অ্যাকচুয়ালি কলেজ গোয়িং এজের চিলড্রেনদের ইমোশন প্রসেসিং প্লাস more than 60 years old, মানে elderly individuals, their emotion processing study করেছিল। So I'll just show you one finding, what we found. So we looked inside the brain, and this is my question, like an audience. How? So we looked inside the brain by giving them a Alfred Hitchcock movie and asked them to process the movie. Every one of us like movie in one way or other. We like some type genre of movie, some other likes other type of movie. আমরা different movie পছন্দ করি, কারণ মুভি খুব সুন্দর অডিও ভিজুয়াল মিডিয়াম, যার বেসিসে আমরা ব্রেনের ফাংশন খুব ভালো করে বুঝতে পারি। And this is very ecological also, কারণ আর্টিফিশিয়াল স্টিমুলি থেকে মুভি স্টিমুলি এঙ্গেজমেন্ট, attentional engagement and functions will be more reliable. তো এই হোপে আমরা ডিজাইন করেছিলাম একটা স্টাডি, যেখানে আমরা অ্যালফ্রেড হিচকক মুভি লোকেদের দেখিয়েছিলাম, which is full of suspense, right? We know Alfred Hitchcock was a master of suspense thrillers. এই মুভিগুলোতে certain brain regions gets more active during highly intense scenes, and they light up, right, during those moments, but not throughout the movie. That means the neurons have selectivity. The neurons like only a certain times when there is some kind of suspense, thrills, a climax, when the neurons start actually responding to the stimuli, right? তখন neurons গুলো respond করতে শুরু করে। How does it look like? So this is basically the movie scene, and we are asking, is he going to shoot someone? Is it blank? Okay. So there is a scene when there is a boy with a gun in his hand and his parents are in the same room. You can see the movie scenes right over here, although you cannot visualize it because it is really small. But these movie scenes are going clip by clip, right? So there is one point in the clip where it gets extremely intense, right? So the boy is about to shoot with a gun, and the gun is loaded. There is bullet in the gun, right? And the parents are completely unaware of it. ওর মা বাবা জানে না। তো তার মানে যদি গানটা চলে তাহলে their parents will get hurt and wounded, right? তো এইরকম সিনে পার্টিসিপেন্টসরা যখন জানে না যে পরের সিনটাতে কি আসবে, তখন পার্টিসিপেন্টসদের যে রেসপন্স আমরা সেগুলোকে কালেক্ট করেছিলাম ট্যাবলেটে, বাই গিভিং দেম আ স্লাইডার টু like explain that whether you are feeling very uncertain, and that's what they did. Their uncertainty increased with the emotional intensity, or what is known as arousal in the emotion literature. So as their emotional intensity rises, the more uncertain they become, and these brain areas actually controls for those uncertainty. এটা হচ্ছে basically brain functions of those areas. Now, why we are interested in these from the disease perspective? Because if there is more uncertainty, more misinformation, it is very highly likely that those are the ones which will be the seed of the affective disorder or emotional disorders like obsessive compulsive disorders, like anxiety disorders. And because we are anxious during that movie scene, therefore it will give us an understanding and insight what happens actually people who are suffering from anxiety disorders. And this was also published by various print medias. They talked about Indian study which learns how brain handles sudden distractions, could help create mental health tools. Then they said, bang, why spoilers can be so frustrating. মানে যখন তুমি একটা climax scene process করছো মুভিতে, suddenly advertisement comes in the TV, right? And you hate it like anything, right? So there are also Nature India who covered these articles. They said Hitchcock film aid research on how brain computes future states of emotion or evolving emotion. And I only give credit not to us for this study, but to master movie maker Alfred Hitchcock, who was able to create those scenes that generates this type of activities of the neurons or response in the brain. And say by ending, there is no terror in the bang, only in the anticipation of it. Because we anticipate this is what it will end up in, right? In the bad ending where the one of the parents will get wounded, that anticipation itself triggers the response, the kind of emotional response and reactivity we are seeing in this case. And the last slide I will show you is, which is one of my, is orientation of attention to a stimulus, right? Okay, so we know our attention is very important for passing exams, right? আমাদের attention যদি না থাকে, আমরা যদি অন্য কিছুর কথা ভাবি এক্সাম হলে, আমরা হয়তো এক্সামটাই পাস করতে পারবো না। হ্যাঁ, তো অবভিয়াসলি অ্যাটেনশন বা অ্যাটেনশনাল যে এরিয়াগুলো ব্রেনের, that is controlled by that ventral attention and dorsal attention network that I showed you, right, just now, for object recognition. So the question comes is যে এই অ্যাটেনশনাল যে শিফটটা হচ্ছে বা এই অ্যাটেনশন যে চেঞ্জ হচ্ছে একটা অবজেক্ট থেকে আরেকটা অবজেক্টে, সেটার সিগনেচারটা ব্রেনে কি? তো এটার আরো একটা ইন্টারেস্টিং তোমার ক্লিনিক্যাল সাইড রয়েছে। তুমি যদি এই পিকচারটা দেখো, এই পিকচারে অ্যাকচুয়ালি তোমরা কি দেখতে পাচ্ছ তোমাদের মনে হয়? কেউ বলতে চাও? প্রথম পিকচারটা আর শেষ পিকচারটা, the first and the last picture, what's the difference between them?
স্টুডেন্টসরা আনমিউট করে একটু বলো।
যদি কেউ বলতে চাও তাহলে তোমরা বলতে পারো। হ্যাঁ
স্যার, ফার্স্ট পিকচারে তো ওটা ক্লিয়ার নেই, বাট লাস্ট পিকচারে ওটা টোটালি ক্লিয়ার হয়েছে ছবিটা।
Correct, absolutely correct. Okay, but why it is not clear in the first picture? Any guess? So, okay, I am revealing it because in the interest of time, I have taken already too much of time. This is Anton Rotherscheid. You can see the signature of the painter below the painting. He is a German artist who actually suffered from stroke in the parietal cortex. You saw the parietal cortex area just few slides back, I showed you, which communicates with IT cortex, which is important for object recognition. So what happened is he had a paralysis or a stroke. So this was just few days after the stroke, and this is done almost after a year from the stroke. Okay, yeah. So if you see, slowly the neurons are starting recovering, right? By the time he reaches here, his functions has nearly recovered. Earlier, he was not able to pay attention to the other side, which is also a disease called hemi-neglect. You neglect one hemisphere. We have two hemispheres, left and right. So therefore, we have two sides for our vision, right? The way we see the world. These are called two hemifields. So therefore, when one set of neurons are not available, then you cannot actually put attention to the other side or remember the other side. So both memory and attention problems happen at the same time, and you only partly remember the other side of your face. So you can do only that much self-portrait. By the time your attentional networks of the brain recovers, you start actually doing your self-portrait as you used to do when the neurons or brain function was intact. Now, the second reason why we interested in studying these is often we have driven the cars on the road. This is a driving simulator, right? So you can drive the cars on the road. These are not the road condition of our streets. Our streets are more chaotic in any way, right? And more crowded. But nonetheless, if any object like that Dalmatian dog, if it comes in front of our car, and if we are not very careful, we know what kind of disastrous situation will happen, right? So therefore, paying attention is very important to our goal, right? Because we want to reach home safely without getting into an accident, right? And the brain areas which controls for these are again the same areas which are known for detection of novelty and attentional reorientation, which is known also as alerting and warning system of the brain, which alerts us when we feel sleepy while driving, right? So therefore, we discovered in our lab which are the brain areas that actually control for these kind of goal-directed attention, where I want to drive safely and reach home or my destination. And there is another set of networks which are composed of these brain areas, which controls for the function which is related to the stimulus-driven attention, that is this Dalmatian dog, which is actually the distractor, right? When we are processing the stimuli. So in laboratory conditions, we have used this type of stimuli where you have the dots randomly moving in one direction or other direction, but then sometimes they move on the left by majority, sometimes they move on the right, and suddenly a distractor comes, and that distractor is this red dot, which distracts and shifts our attention. And when we map the brain areas, which actually shifts our attention towards this distractor, because we cannot do the dog experiment or the car experiment on a crowded street, right? So therefore, we use an artificial stimuli. But our artificial stimuli is very interesting because we can actually look at the movement of these dots on overall right or left and ask our students or participants, can you guess which directions overall these dots are moving? Some will say or give the right response. And when they give the right response, we know that they were doing the goal-oriented task, possibly correctly. Whereas when their attention is drifted towards the distractor, which is like that Dalmatian dog, then obviously they are not able to process the actual task, right? And the brain areas which were responsible for these, we could functionally map those brain areas, right? Which actually is one of the most challenging problem for people who are suffering from anxiety, also attention disorders like ADHD and also autism, where they can only process part of these information. The other part of the information, these network of neurons are unable to process. So that's where I think I will end. I will skip this part and I will just summarize here opportunities for undergraduate students in brain science and applications. I think this is a very new field as far as whole world is concerned and also India is concerned, but it has an enormous scope because it is very interdisciplinary. केउ computer science background, mathematics background, physics background, chemistry background, from any background you can come and you can study the brain as a complex biological system, right? Which is at the hot seat of understanding and diagnosing neurological diseases understanding the progression of treatment, and also look at the, you know, uh, like what kind of decisions clinicians and doctors are taking. And you can kind of provide lots of technological support also to the doctors. And specifically, you can also help many different industries like aviation, automobile, sports, video games, right? Because many of those industries relies on decision making, sensory processing. There is enormous market on, like, finding, many industries are looking for good engineers and scientists with good engineerings and basic knowledge of neurophysiology. And there is also a lot of integrative methods and concepts from behavioral level to the molecular level, and which requires the understanding of how central nervous system functions and how they can be repaired, enhanced, or compensated. Thus, neuroscience basically covers almost all biomedical technologies and application, and people can combine many different skills like optics, electronics, informatics, robotics, physiology, chemistry, name it, and it can be applied. Okay, as you have probably seen, and I was able to convince you throughout my talk. And last thing I will do is I'll just acknowledge my collaborators, my lab members. I am not the only one who is doing this work. There are a lot of people who are involved in this process, and they require the due credit. And I'll also be thankful to my collaborators outside India and within India, who has been very pivotal in shaping up my scientific personality and thinking, and also actively collaborating with very valuable suggestions to spearhead our lab. And I'm also fortunate to India government because we have been thoroughly supported throughout my last 10-15 years of work that I have done in my lab. Without those supports, none of these would have been possible. And thank you again to the organizers for giving me this excellent opportunity to engage with the students. Okay.
Yes, it was really nice and actually mesmerizing to hear to you. And we couldn't imagine where actually the 2 hours have passed by because it is so interesting.
I just did not realize that I took such a long time.
That is
I
so
should have
nice,
been.
sir. Actually, I am very happy that students are so much hooked up and they were expecting more and more about the brain they want to learn. I think brain is the only thing we want to learn and think about because it is a control center of the body. So anything or any information we get about our brain, it is very exciting and interesting to all of us, whether we are faculty members,
Certainly.
whether we are research scholars or whether we are students. So it is so enlightening, sir, that you say, yeah, we are fortunate enough to get so much of time of you within your busy schedule. So thank you very much, sir.
I think I am very happy to engage with them, and I am really thankful to them for their patience to hear me out for the entire
It
session.
was so interesting. I think many of the students may be having some questions, but it is
Please.
9. So if any student can have, they can ask any questions, or we can have some. We also have, sir, one feedback for our students. Feedback session. So they can also send the questions to us in the feedback form, and I can just accumulate and send all of the questions to you. So
Absolutely. Because I think it is almost closing to 9. I think all of you have other works and as well. So I don't want to go on in the QA, like question and answer session, for too long also. Yeah. But that said, if somebody has a very interesting question, or not even just interesting, I mean, any questions that I can answer, like, shortly, I would be happy to take.
Definitely. So any students can unmute yourselves and just ask questions. Any of the students who have questions. Yeah. Yes. Please go ahead.
Sir?
Yes, please.
So, cognitive training or such kinds of occupational therapy can reduce the hemi-neglect problems?
That's another very good question. So, like, cognitive training, okay, or which you call cognitive training, there is a very specific type of training which is called cognitive behavioral therapy, CBT. Now, the
Yes, sir.
CBT,
CBT.
this training is actually used for some kind of, psychiatric disorders or affective disorders like the one I mentioned about during my talk, related to emotional stimulus processing like OCD, obsessive compulsive disorder, anxiety disorders. So certainly those kind of CBT techniques has been shown to have a greater effect on reducing anxiety. Whereas if you realize the hemi neglect problem is more related to the internal damage to the neurons and their pathways, right? Okay, in their basic circuits of processing. So that actually requires probably a different kinds of plasticity or neuroplasticity, where the neurons which are close by in the visual area, which is still functioning normally, if they can actually understand their projections or the inputs which are coming from other set of neurons, which can sort of what you call like redirect the pathways and find an alternative pathway in order to come in, open up certain communication channels to send their ascending inputs to those neurons, right? And it's actually cannot be necessarily uh, completely addressed using cognitive behavioral therapy. Okay, maybe partly it can be done by doing some kind of visual trainings. Just like if somebody has a stroke or a paralysis, there are two major symptoms, right? One related to the blurriness of vision or visual impairments, as well as like you see motor symptoms, right, where one side is down, you hardly can move your paralytic hand, right? And you have to use the opposite hand. And then there is another kind of like problems which you find, which is related to the aphasia, that is the loss of language and speech, right? So with some amount of training, right, which is not a cognitive behavioral therapy, but the doctors and clinicians who are treating the patient, they usually like give you them very slow doses of this type of task, right, which allows them to kind of acquire the loss of speech and language in a slow manner, right, over time. And this is actually, right, is a long process because it may take 6 months for some patients, it may take 12 months for some patients, it never can recover to the same level. Okay, so all kinds of clinical case studies exist. Okay, however, cognitive behavioral therapy, which you wanted to know about, I would say has more effectiveness when it comes to these kind of anxiety disorders and other kind of psychiatric disorders. Yeah. Okay.
Okay, sir. Thank you, sir.
Yeah.
Yeah,
I
sir.
hope I was able to
Can we
answer.
take few more questions, sir, with your
Yeah, yeah.
permission?
Sure. Sure.
So there is another question by Aslam, our student, who has written that can we truly consider ourselves? You can just visualize the say question. It is over there. Conscious.
Yeah, can we truly consider ourselves conscious beings if our subconscious brain processes are influencing our decisions and actions? Oh, a question though, excellent question. It's a very interesting question. It's a question for both a neuroscientist and also a philosopher,
Yes.
and as well as like any kind of people who are working with informatics as well, right? But I can give you one example in order to try to address that question. So, for example, if I show you some kind of stimulus which is uh, at the level of your like range of your perception, right? Okay, you may be able to detect that stimulus. So, for example, if I show you a flash of light and then very next moment, right, with some small interval, which we call interstimulus interval, which may be in milliseconds, like 2 milliseconds or 1 milliseconds, or maybe slightly longer. 1 millisecond is really small, right? Okay. So when I show you one flash followed by another flash, and if I give you that small interval of time, it may happen that the second stimulus or the second flash is completely missed by you. Okay. You have counted both the flash together when I asked you how many flashes did you see as only one single flash, right? Now, this you can view as that our subconscious, right, sort of areas are not able to like reach a threshold for detection of the second flash. Okay. Yeah. But we are conscious about the first flash because our sub threshold could cross a threshold for the detection, right? Whereas in with training, one can make you learn uh, processing these kind of double flashes, right, which is sort of presented one after the other with the smallest of sort of interval in time, right? And you are able to detect the second flash as well, right? Or it may happen that your subconscious, what you calling subconscious, like I would go to talk about subconscious, but you hit the neurons with some external electrical stimulation and pulses, and that actually enlarges the dynamic capacity of the neurons, or their ability to even detect the smallest of threshold. Then it may be able to consciously perceive the second one. Okay. And however, in many a times our perception is challenged because the bandwidth of the perception in which we process actually the stimulus properties, right, color, orientation, edges, or the geometry, the symmetry which is present in those objects, our subconscious sort of has not reached that threshold for detection, right? It means the neurons, if you take a neuron's view, right, which is a very neurocentric view, but if you take a neuron's view, you can in other words say the excitability of the neurons has not reached that level, right, which is sufficient for generating or eliciting a response of the neurons to that stimuli. Or it can be also said in other words, if I give a very boring talk, most of your neurons will stay silent, right? Okay. They will probably not reach the threshold for firing because neurons will say, hey, look at it. I have to store a lot of ATP. I have to actually go through the whole metabolic processes. And this is very consuming metabolically, that why should I care about this talk, which is so boring talk, right? Yeah. All right. So the neurons don't fire. Now that you can talk about I am conscious about it that this is a boring talk, but the neurons are not firing, right? Okay. So that actually also is possible, right? If you think about it. Yeah.
Yes, sir. It was a good one.
And the last thing I just wanted to mention, because it's such an interesting question, that there are a lot of people who are in deep coma, right? There are people who actually record from people who are in coma or who are anesthetized, right? Okay. So they have essentially loss of consciousness studies, right? In which people have actually recorded the brain activities, and they found the difference what they see during sleep stages versus right when you are in coma or when you have a loss of consciousness. There are very recent studies in 2023 and 2024, including some of my past colleagues who have actually done excellent work in that domain. And they have shown actually that is one way of looking at consciousness. And if you are very interested on these, you can look at Professor Anil Seth, who is in UK, his work on consciousness and his book on consciousness. And he tries to come up with these kind of experiments that I was talking about, and to understand how to approach the question of consciousness from that angle. Okay. because otherwise the consciousness question will become very philosophical question, right?
Yeah.
Which may have a very good answer in philosophy, and we all should try to understand that, because the philosophy is very important for understanding science and any kind of science for that matter. But philosophy is not enough, right, to answer the question of consciousness, right? Yeah.
Yes, sir. Yes, sir. And it was a brilliant experiment, I would say, sir. The difference in between our sleep mode as well as in the coma, because it is actually showing that some sort of consciousness is there.
Right.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
So we can partially or minimally, we can say, consider ourselves as conscious when we are not at coma, but in the sleep stage.
Yes.
Absolutely. That
Absolutely.
is a very good work, I would say. So I think students have enjoyed a lot the lecture. Faculty members have also. There are many questions coming on, but we are actually
I can see there are a lot of questions coming up.
Yes, sir, and there is appreciation also from our faculty members. So I can just communicate the questions to you, and it will be so nice if you can come to our college, sir. Then these students will be able to see you, to meet you, and actually interact with such an expert from you, sir.
No, certainly. Actually, I also like, present in person rather than like an online presentation, because
yes, sir,
this also has a different impact and helps us to engage more in terms of discussions.
Definitely.
So I'm more than looking forward to it. And next time, whenever I come, I will get in touch with you.
Definitely, sir. Do inform us at least 1 week before. We will be arranging everything.
Okay. Thank you.
Yes,
Thank
sir.
you.
And it will be so nice to have you in our college. So our head of the botany department, Dr. Ashok Bhattacharya, has also thanked you a lot.
Yes, thank you, Dr. Bhattacharya. I am looking forward to meeting all of you.
Thank you. We are very much happy and being a very good teacher, sir, you are, because all the students, they are very much fully, they have given their concentration and to listen your nice lecture and presentation. And it is very much interesting.
Thank you. আমার জন্য এটা একটা খুব excellent opportunity. I have done this few times in other DBT STAR colleges, actually.
Yes, sir.
So I think every time I do these, it renews my interest in neuroscience. Also, I am a beneficiary of this process.
Very nice, actually, very nice, sir. We are very much enriched from your such type of the most promising lecture, sir.
Yes, sir.
Of course, sir, you try to get time so that we can meet you by physical mode one day in our college.
Sure. Next time I come to Kolkata or West Bengal, I will definitely get in touch with you.
Definitely,
and we would love to come to your college and meet with everyone.
Yes,
sir. Actually, Anirban sir visited us during our DBT STAR College Scheme. He has been such a nice mentor of us, and he has helped us a lot in running off this, implementing the DBT STAR College Scheme in a successful way.
Well, he's the one who is instrumental. Actually, he's the one who told me to give this talk, and
yes, sir.
Because of his request, actually, I was able to get in touch with you. Yeah,
definitely, sir. And sir has arranged many invited lectures for us, as well as he came to our college. He is always giving us new ideas, and also all of the things that you should post this, and you should put all of the things in YouTube for others. We get all innovative ideas from Anirban, sir. So
he was my colleague for many years. We had papers also together. So we are still in good communications, and I meet with him occasionally every year. Okay.
স্যার এতটাই আমাদেরকে হেল্প করেন বা করছেন, আমাদের স্টার কলেজ স্কিমে খুবই সুবিধা হচ্ছে রান করা। So this lecture was only because of him we could communicate with a nice.
Absolutely.
Yes, sir. So can we just wind up, sir? We can take.
Yes, please. I think some people are still raising hand. Maybe you can compile their question.
Otherwise,
yes. One student is raising his hand. Devjit.
Yes, can we take because
Sure. I think this is probably the last question. You are the moderator, so you have to take a call.
yes. We can have his question. Devjit, can you hear us? You can just speak, unmute yourself, or I can just read out your question, whatever is feasible to you.
Is it the question? It's written also in the chat window.
Yes, he has written
That how can we increase our brain power as to understand, memorize easily everything more and more than now? What is the process?
Because they are some undergraduate students you can expect.
Yeah, no, I think more on a like, you can say, like, scientific formulation of this question. You can think like, that is there some way like people can change their lifestyle, right? And go through certain type of lifestyles that actually can, like, make you memorize things better, right? That is certainly possible. And you can think about it that the attention and memory, they are very interlinked, right? Okay, so therefore once you increase your attention, your capacity to memorize things also increases. This has been shown in experiments, right? Okay, so if you measure the memory capacity and duration for how long you can memorize things, okay, these all, in spite of the change in brain anatomy and structure with age, uh, is really depends on your level of attention and how attention actually remains unwavered, right, through a sustained age, right? And that requires also some type of, ways people have done experiments in their lab, right? For example, in University of Wisconsin medical school, sleep extensively, right? They have tried to see, like, if you sleep for good 8 hours or 7.5 hours or more, whether that actually enhances your attention, sustainability of attention or sustenance of attention, and whether in turn that has an impact on memory enhancement, right? Then people have tried also bring people from the Tibetan monasteries, right, to do their brain imaging to see whether the Tibetan monks who have practiced, like, years of meditation in one style of meditation, right, for 20 years or more, whether these trained meditators have able to generate brains evoked activity, which should suggest or shows that they have a sustained attention for a long period of time, which also has an impact on their memory capacities, right? Yeah. And we, of course, know from Swami Vivekananda, right? Like all of you probably have read, because in West Bengal, right, many people know about Swami Vivekananda. You have seen, like, he mentioned about these, not doing any actual human experiments, but he just mentioned about these, right? Many of his writings, right? Yeah, that enhances brain power. So I don't know whether I could fully satisfy you with that answer, or that is the answer you are expecting, but this is at best I can give at the moment, right?
Yes.
Actually, I
It was a
think that
brilliant answer,
Devjit
sir.
is happy to have your answer, sir. Actually, Devjit is very interested to know, because he very often he forgets the thing. That's why he is asking.
Right. No, I
He's
think,
our
I mean, these
student.
are genuine, like,
Yes,
trainings
sir.
or genuine, like, scenarios which actually impacts our attention and
Definitely.
working memory
Yes.
or our memory functions, right, in
Yes.
general.
Yes,
Because if you don't sleep well, how
yes,
Yeah,
deprived individuals have very poor memory. And
definitely.
similarly, when people have done experiments on mouse model or animal models, they have found the same thing,
Yes.
right? Sleep deprivation leads to memory loss or weakening of memory, right?
Yeah. Yes, and not only memory, I would say it also freshens up the brain, because suppose I have experienced myself. Suppose I am in a very difficult research questions. I have a good sleep. After that, I am able to think and just realize the things.
Sure.
So I think
we don't do experiments typically. Like when we take participants in our experiments, there are certain inclusion criteria, and one of the exclusion criteria is that you don't come to experiments with lot of drinking, lot of coffee, right?
Caffeine.
because that can have an effect actually in the way you give an exaggerated response,
Yes,
right?
yes. It is stimulating the senses, and
so you don't want that unless your experiment has some kind of a research question like that, right?
Yes, definitely, sir. So it was really a nice experience for us.
Same here.
Sir, and we would like to also have you in our college, so we can just officially wind up the session. This entire session has been recorded, and we can have it in the YouTube, so students can watch it more and more times, and if they have any questions, can send me, and I will be communicating to sir. So
I sincerely hope that whatever I delivered here in terms of the content and also the work that we have done, hopefully this was very interesting for the students.
Definitely, sir. It was very interesting, and it is the scene that students are go on asking their questions. That is the best proof of that. They found it very interesting.
And you have attended all the questions up to the last one.
Thank you, everyone. It's very late at night. So thank you, everyone. And I think I will definitely like to get an opportunity to meet with you in future in person.
We will be very happy to have you. The pleasure will be all ours.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir. We can just officially wind up the sessions. Thanks to all participants for your kind attention, and special thanks to our resource person.